The Seven Years' War was a series of conflicts fought on a global stage from 1756 to 1763. The war reflected the intense commercial rivalries that developed from European explorations and their desire to establish trading posts in the Americas and Asia. It ultimately ended with Britain as the most powerful. In North America, the French and Indian War was the stage for direct fighting between the French and the British. The Holy Roman Empire was a fragmented empire centered in modern-day Austria and Hungary and controlled by the Habsburg family. Through alliances and marriage, the empire included Germany, Bohemia, Switzerland, and northern Italy. The Ottoman Turks conquered Hungary in 1526. Following the peace negotiated at the end of the 30 Years' War, the empire was significantly reduced and lasted with no real power until 1806. The 30 Years' War was a conflict centered in Europe and fought between 1618 and 1648. It resulted from attempts of the Holy Roman Emperor to force his subjects to return to the Catholic faith. The Peace of Westphalia negotiated the end of the war and left a weakened Holy Roman Empire. German states were giving their independence and Prussia emerged as the most powerful. Switzerland was given its independence and France added new territories. This peace was the beginning of nation-states in Europe. Alliances among nation-states were formed in response to perceived threats and the balance of power, as nations sought to limit the power of any one nation.
Absolutism was a political theory that dominated Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was the political theory that monarchs have complete control over their subjects by divine right. Divine right asserted that the right to rule was given to monarchs from God. Absolutism was best exemplified by King Louis XIV of France. Known as the Sun King, Louis built a lavish palace at Versailles, and its grandeur came to symbolize his wealth and power. His chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, helped to build a centralized bureaucracy that ensured complete loyalty to the king. The French nobility were made to live at Versailles while Louis and his ministers oversaw France's economic development, the making of laws and waging of wars. Louis never called the Estates General France's lawmaking body. He revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had extended religious protection to the French Protestants, and his participation in many wars left France in debt. The English Civil War was a conflict between supporters of the English monarchy and members of the Parliament who sought a constitutional state. Charles I refused to meet with Parliament until he needed money. Then Parliament forced him to agree to the Petition of Right, which limited taxation and forbade arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. Charles ignored the petition and didn't call on Parliament again until he needed financial help. The Long Parliament then met and tried to limit the monarch's power. Charles responded to this by leading a group of soldiers into Parliament in an attempt to arrest his biggest critics. Civil war quickly followed. This war resulted in Charles being executed, and after the brief reign of Oliver Cromwell and his military dictatorship, Parliament invited Charles' son, Charles II, to serve as a limited monarch. Charles II had to agree to the writ of habeas corpus, which protects the people from arbitrary arrest.
When the Catholic James II came into power, he began to try to assert his power as an absolute monarch. In the Glorious Revolution, one without bloodshed, Parliament invited William, James' son-in-law, to rule as long as he agreed to the English Bill of Rights. James and his heir fled the country, and the Bill of Rights established that all of England's future monarchs would be Anglican and that their power would be limited.
Beginning in the 17th century, scientists began to challenge classical ideas. This was known as the Scientific Revolution. Throughout the Middle Ages, it was believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe, which was supported by the Church and based on classical Greek and Roman ideas. However, in the mid-1500s, Nicholas Copernicus argued that the sun was at the center of the universe and based this assertion on mathematical proof. Galileo Galilei was a mathematician and astronomer who learned to build telescopes in order to observe the skies and found evidence of this heliocentric theory. Isaac Newton, a mathematician, used observation and math to prove his theories, including his theory of universal gravitation. René Descartes was a scientist, mathematician, and philosopher who focused on the importance of reason and its essential role in the quest for truth. These people used a new approach to science based on reason, observation, and experimentation, known as the scientific method. Stating a problem, gathering data, forming a hypothesis, experimenting, and drawing a conclusion. Deism was a belief system that emerged in the wake of the scientific revolution and has a clear focus on an orderly universe based on nature and reason. Deism recognized that a powerful God played a role in the creation of the universe, but asserts that God oversees the world and allows it to function on natural laws.
John Locke was an Englishman who believed in natural rights possessed by all human beings, including those of life, liberty, and property. He argued that governments had the responsibility to protect these rights, and if they failed to do so, the people had the right to revolt. Montesquieu believed in the separation of powers and argued that there should be three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, so that no person or group would have too much power through a system of checks and balances. Voltaire believed in the concepts of free speech and religious toleration.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau,
a French philosopher, argued in his The Social Contract that in forming governments, people must give up their own personal interests for the good of all. Enlightenment ideas were unpopular with many governments and with the Church, both of whom sought to censor new ideas about reason and nature. There was limited acceptance of Enlightenment ideas among monarchs such as Maria Theresa of Austria and Catherine the Great of Russia, who used their positions of authority to make some non-political changes in society, like building schools and hospitals. Enlightenment ideas played a key role in the American and French revolutions and Latin American wars for independence.
In America, the 13 British colonies resented legislation passed by the British Parliament that levied taxes to pay off their debts accumulated during the 7 years in French and Indian War. Under the banner, "No taxation without representation," they sought the right to govern themselves. In 1774, the Continental Congress was formed to oversee the colonists' anti-British actions. And on July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, which was passed upon many Enlightenment ideas.
The colonists fought for independence and with the aid of France, forced the British to surrender in 1781. Following the end of the war, the newly formed United States of America emerged as a federal republic with a government based on popular sovereignty. This revolution had enormous influence on subsequent revolutions around the world.
In France in 1789, King Louis XVI summoned representatives to a meeting of the Estates General to convince them of the necessity of raising taxes, since France was deeply in debt as a result of excessive domestic and foreign spending. Representatives from the Third Estate, which made up over 95% of the population, met with the king and tried to convince him to approve extensive social, economic, and political reforms that would give them more rights and protections. However, since each of the three estates received one vote, an outcome in their favor was unlikely. In June of 1789, the Third Estate broke away from the Estates General and declared themselves the National Assembly. The following month, with the storming of Bastille, revolution spread across the country. Under the banner Life, Liberty, and Fraternity, the National Assembly read the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which identified the natural rights of citizens, stated the equality of all men, and expressed the belief that sovereignty belonged to the people. A new constitution adopted in 1791 established a constitutional monarchy, allowing the king to retain his power. Unhappiness with this new form of government led to the creation of a new constitution and the end of the National Assembly. A new constitution gave the convention the power to govern, which abolished the monarch entirely. Then the Jacobins, a group of radicals, seized control, and the Committee of Public Safety was created, led by Maximilien Robespierre. This began the Reign of Terror as they jailed and killed anyone suspected of anti-revolutionary thought or action. A new constitution, drawn up in 1795, ended this phase and led to the creation of Napoleon was a general in the French army who gained control of France in a coup d'etat in 1799, seizing control from the Directory, a small group of governing aristocrats. He instituted a new constitution and crowned himself emperor in 1804. His political and social reforms brought much-needed stability to a country that had been in the midst of a revolution since 1789. His civil code extended political and legal equality to all adult men, and religious toleration was promoted. His armies conquered much of Europe, and monarchs across the continent were replaced with Napoleon's family members. His invasion of Russia in 1812 ended in disaster when his troops were unable to continue fighting in the harsh conditions of a bitter cold Russian winter. After his failure in Russia, Napoleon's enemies, led by the British, forced him into exile in 1814. The Congress of Vienna was a meeting held from 1814 to 1815 in Vienna and attended by representatives of the nations that had defeated Napoleon. The goal was to restore Europe to the way it was prior to the French Revolution. The American and French Revolution and the ideals of the Enlightenment inspired independence movements in Latin America. Beginning with a successful slave revolt, Haiti was the first nation in Latin America to declare its independence in 1804. Creole leaders, resentful of the power and privilege of the peninsulars, spread revolutionary ideas throughout the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. The majority of Spanish and Portuguese colonies gained their independence in the early 1800s, taking advantage of Napoleon's invasion of Europe. Notable independence leaders included Miguel Hidalgo, who gathered together the indigenous and mestizo populations of Mexico, and Simon Bolivar, a Creole who fought against Spanish rule in South America. Although most of Latin America had independence by 1825, power continued to be concentrated in the hands of the elite, a combination of Creoles, caudillos, and military leaders, a trend that continued through the 20th century. The French colony of Saint Domingo was the first colony in Latin America to gain its independence. It began as a slave revolt in which enslaved Africans rebelled against French settlers. Although slaves were granted their freedom in 1798, the rebellion continued as they demanded rights. Fearful that the slaves might succeed in overthrowing the white settlers, Napoleon sent the French troops to the island and put down the revolt. In 1804, Saint Domingo declared its independence, renamed Haiti, and it became the first republic in Latin America. The United States was refused to recognize the new republic.
So let's dance.